What we have for today is a state of the meta recap for the Midnight Beta, as we are now approximately about 25 or so days before the release of Midnight. We are taking a look at how specs have been continuing to perform in the beta for the past 2 or 3 or so weeks since the last couple of relevant balance tuning changes hitting the Midnight Beta, to see which we can see right now as the better performing specs, for example in higher Mythic Plus keys, which of the specs are looking to be the best so far, whether or not this might translate to being some of the possibly first place for being considered a meta or a very good spec for when Midnight releases. So the first in line we have to talk about for today is also coincidentally the most played DPS spec in Mythic Plus right now, and is also, we can say, overall the strongest one. However, we had this asterisk already when we talked about the raid results a few days ago, which is Demonology Warlock, and their performance in Mythic Plus being extremely good is also lined up with a series of bugs currently giving them quite the overperformance. Most of it can be summed up and tied down to Soul Harvester, the damage itself of Soul Harvester from your succulent souls being able to be double consumed, as well as the spell queue cheesing for extra damage of both Doomfiend and your Grimoire Felguard that you play with, as well as still also the double damage, double hitting of Wicked Reaping. So basically your entire hero talent right now is being, quite overperforming. Is practically doing some 20% of your entire damage just from the hero talent abilities themselves. The other question mark about Demo talking about their performance right now is their Apex talent, You have an Apex talent that's doing between 25 and 30% of all of your damage. In fact, if you put together your hero talent and your Apex talent, more than half of your damage actually is not going to come from your buttons, but from your demons spawned by your Apex talents and your succulent souls, and the damage they do from your hero talent. Besides that though, assuming the bug fixes won't completely destroy the spec, the damage is very good. Even the damage profile of the spec, the single target damage they can do while doing AoE damage, which is always very prized in Mythic Plus, being able to do that is quite good as a demo. Not one of the best, not one of the S tier ones, but definitely not super flat damage profile. So while right now they are super popular and also doing very well, we will have to see exactly just how much they will be hit by the eventual, because it will come eventually, fixing rather, of their hero talent in particular, and possibly even the nerf to their Apex talent damage. Now after demo we have to go to an unfortunate place, so I have to put a warning. It might cause some PTSD triggers to mention this, but we have 2 different Mage specs in the S tier of performance in the beta. Yes, of course, it's Mage again, and it's both Arcane and Frost, which have been the better performers so far in Mythic Plus, amongst the better performers in Mythic Plus. In terms of, wide popularity, Frost Mage is the way more popular one compared to Arcane, despite the performances being quite often even. We have talked at length about both of the Mage specs. Now that you've also gotten the pre-patch in live for yourself, you also know pretty much what has changed for them, so there is not too much need to go into detail about how, Shatter works. You all have Shatter in live as well, you know what it does. The biggest divide between the 2 specs is that Arcane still retains its ability to do prio damage, extra single target damage on the main target they are hitting, even in AoE. You see this classic damage profile in a big Mythic Plus pool when you're trying to focus on one main target. Arcane will usually end up being the top damage on that target, for the very simple reason that even when they are in AoE, Arcane Barrage is doing single target damage, Arcane Missiles is still hitting the main target for more, because even if you play with Ether Attunement to hit 5 targets with Arcane Missiles, the main target will still take more. Even if you have full Arcane charges to hit more enemies with Arcane Barrage, the main target will still take more damage. So they obviously have an innate extra damage on single target even while in AoE that is remaining in Midnight. That is perhaps still the weakness of Frost Mage. Frost Mage does have a much wider but also flatter damage profile. A lot of their damage is just inherently free AoE. You are hitting with Glacial Spike, which is supposed to be doing single target damage, but Flash Freeze Burn will do AoE. You are hitting with Flurry, which is single target, but Glacial Assault will do AoE. you're hitting with Frostbolt and Flurry, which are still single target, and then Shatter, of course, will do AoE. Ray of Frost is single target, but Splintering Ray is AoE. So you have this result when it comes to Frost Mage, where unlike Arcane, where some 75% of their damage still goes fully on a single target, even in AoE, when it comes to Frost, it's closer to like 25-ish% of your damage is on the main target you are targeting. All the rest, it's just splash AoE. It's just wide AoE. So your ability to do extra focused prio single target damage is much weaker compared to Arcane. So if you were thinking about, or rather if you were an enjoyer of either one of these two, and you're shilling and promoting and hoping for one of these two only to be the strong one when the expansion launches, then if you're wishing to play Frost Mage, you would want to hope for another spec to be the strongest prio damage, funnel, single target damage dealer, better than Arcane. So that in your Mythic Plus meta comp, you will go with that spec over Arcane, which will free up a spot for you as a Frost Mage, as the, you know, flat and very high AoE damage dealer, sort of like an Unholy DK or a Frost DK or a Balanced Druid of the past. If you want to play Arcane, and you're an Arcane fan, then what you need to hope for is that there are going to be enough of these high, consistent AoE damage specs that you don't need Frost Mage, and that you remain one of the strongest of the single target prio damage dealing specs. So that since it will be needed, one spec with that kind of profile in your Mythic Plus comp will be needed, then you will be picked as Arcane over Frost Mage. That is kind of the divide right now between Frost and Arcane, even though both of them are doing very well. So at the moment, not that it comes as quite the news, it's quite a safe space to be going for Mage to play in the next expansion when it comes to safety in finding a spot eventually in Mythic Plus, either as Frost or as Arcane for now. Now, taking a break for a second for the DPS, after we went through the first three of the bunch, the tank. Because the most played tank, the best tank, and also the tank played in the higher of keys in the beta right now, is Brewmaster. After the initial beginnings of the beta where Blood DK was the way to go, the nerf to Sun Lane, the fall of Blood DK, Vengeance Demon Hunter took over for a couple of months, but slowly. Eventually, but slowly, despite not really any major nerfs to Vengeance or major buffs to Brewmaster, Brewmaster gained ground to the point where now it's the most played of the tanks. Now, since this is often mentioned as a possible reason why a certain tank is being played, no, it's not damage. Brewmaster is not weak, doesn't do weak damage, but it's also not one of the top damage dealers or one of the ones with far more damage than the others. You will be looking at Protection Paladin right now for damage. Vengeance right now can, for example, match the damage of a Brewmaster Monk. So it's not necessarily about the damage Brewmaster is doing. We have touched before about the much improved self-healing and self-sufficient tools Brewmaster has compared to the past. They are much less tied to being babysat by a healer nowadays. Vital Flame is arguably your strongest newly added defensive talent, healing for a portion of the fire or nature damage you do, and fire or nature damage is a large portion of your damage, because it's not just Breath of Fire, Flurry Strikes. Since you are playing as Shadowpan, the most damage that comes from Flurry Strikes is not the Flurry Strike itself, but the extra explosion passive it has, which is nature damage. That's what gives it extra value. So you have quite the increased self-healing thanks to these two added tools, both the Vital Flame talent and your Apex talent that you don't quite have yet in live. Bring Me Another. Your empty barrels on a 20% chance to spawn every time you drink a brew is good for damage for starters, but whenever you use your Celestial Brew or Infusion or Fortifying Brew, you also get your Refreshing Drink, which is an extra very powerful hot. Those two are very good, but in general what has strengthened since the last expansion has been your tankiness. Your Apex talent is very good for that as well, because fine, the Bring Me Another empty barrel doing more damage is whatever, it's welcome, but it's not that big of a deal. The much big of a deal is the fact that whenever you gain this empty barrel, so this 1 in 5 chance every time you drink a brew to get this barrel, you get the free reset of Keg Smash. and also the free energy cost. This is very good because of course every keg you use is a 3-second cooldown reduction on your brews. So the more keg smash you cast, the more CDR you get, the more brews you cast, the more chances you have to proc an empty barrel, which will reset the cooldown of your keg smash, which will further increase the cooldown reduction of your brews. And it gives you quite the increase, because for example, in this 30-minute key, you get 132 procs of empty barrel, which is roughly about a 1 keg smash reset every 13 seconds for free. You can even see it fully in action when you look at BRM and the cast per minute. You know, nowadays in the beta already, you have some 8.5 to 8.7 casts per minute of Purifying Brew, when this used to be around 6.5 casts per minute in live before this pre-patch. Even Celestial Brew itself, which also gets reduced in cooldown, used to be in the 1.8 to 2 casts per minute range. So you have a nearly 40% increase number of casts of your Purifying Brew and 20% increase number of casts of Celestial Brew, which is in part helped by this extra cooldown reduction of your Apex talent. So all in all, the improvements of Brewmaster are quite visible, and it has made them a very stable and solid tank for now in the beta. Now, another detour moving away from tanks. This will be slightly shorter because it's for healers. There hasn't been nearly as many surprises like we had for tanks in the beta. More or less since the beginning, the one to look for healers was Resto Druid. And it has remained so even now. Resto Druid right now, when it comes to high keys, is more played than more or less all of the other healers combined. So it's worth taking a look at. Not much is changing playstyle wise, because you're still Wild Stalker as a Resto Druid, you still play very similarly, but you had of course quite a few changes because of the pruning and because of the change of certain abilities. It's quite visible if you look at the healing of a live Resto Druid compared to the beta version. You see the absolute cratering of the healing power of your hero talent. You see Symbiotic Blooms and Busting Growth have lost like 300% of their power compared to live, so you are much less carried by your hero talent now. You have a very strong Apex talent when it comes to group content, not raid content. Raid content is kind of an afterthought, but it becomes very good in Mythic Plus. It does help you in one of your weaknesses, because as a Resto Druid, you were quite proactive. You had to sort of set up your hots, set up your running rejues, and made sure you had your Swift Mend into Wild Growth for hot healing before the damage came. You couldn't just heal very often on the spot, quickly and instantly. This helps you a lot, this Apex talent, because you have this constantly running Life Bloom splash healing on your allies thanks to Everbloom, which ends up being a reasonable part of your total healing, on top of the last bit of your Apex talent, which will actually end up being practically half of the healing of your Life Bloom. The fact that every time you consume Soul of the Forest, so every time you Swiftmend and then you consume it with Reju or with Regrowth, you cause Life Bloom to bloom 5 times in a row. And because you have Everbloom, that is also going to be splashing for 15% of the value to all of your party members. And all of this is very good, constant, passive AoE healing. So now you have your Efflorescence on the ground with the QOL of following around your Life Bloom target, so it's even easier to hit all members of your party, plus the Everbloom, Life Bloom splash healing, plus your Apex talent that makes Life Bloom bloom multiple times every time you Swiftmend. All of these are all very good extra help in constant AoE healing, and then you still have Regrowth. You still have your Machine Gun rapid fire Regrowth casts of a very, very powerful spell. It is not getting any weaker. If anything, it has even received the tools to become even stronger, like Intensity, to make it heal for even more when it crits. And obviously, because of Abundance, because of things like improved Regrowth, you have even more ways to crit with Regrowth normally, so Intensity will have even more value. All in all, despite the few changes, like the power shift away from your hero talent into your toolkit and your Apex talent, has still kept Resto Druid as the strongest healer so far in the beta, at least when it comes to group content, lower, smaller target content. Now the next in line, back to the DPS, the next in line is kind of something we hoped we could forget for a while. It's back though, it will be back in Midnight, I'm afraid, if this is the trend. It's Augmentation. Augmentation is in the top 5 of most played DPS specs so far in the beta. Now, Augmentation now has a much more similar to an actual DPS kind of result. When you look at even the top results purely looking at DPS, just like DPS rankings, now you actually can see Augmentation even fight with other DPS specs, which means you can now even see it in the results of Augmentation doing much better. Now, doing much better and actually playing better are not the same thing. Augmentation is not particularly improved as a spec. Many might lament the reduced complexity of Augmentation. You pretty much won't need anymore any of your Google Docs sheets on how to properly buff players and time your Ebon Mites and target players with your Prescience. Much of this is gone. Much of this can just be automated and blindly cast and auto-targeted on your DPS with Prescience, for example. Pretty much the only complex thought you have left as Augmentation is deciding when to Ebon Mite. Should we finish this pack with another Ebon Mite? Should I instead hold it and start banking on my essences and banking on my essence burst procs to save them for when we enter the next pool in Mythic Plus? That's just about the most thoughtful thing you can do nowadays as Augmentation in the beta. So while this extra performance right now is quite welcome for Augmentation mains, doesn't really follow with any extra sort of complexity of the spec. I guess you can say if you were one of those players that didn't really like Augmentation, did not like this entire thing around having this buffing spec, also having it difficult to gauge your own performance because you have an Augmentation in the group, for example. A lot of this will be gone in Midnight, as we mentioned. Much of the power now is still within the spec itself. A lot of that hidden power, hidden defensive power of Aug is now gone. But for now, at least as far as their offensive performance goes, they have been doing very well in Mythic Plus. Now, since I felt it was kind of mean to finish the entire video completely ignoring the melee DPS specs, although it's not my fault, the best performing specs right now in the beta were basically all ranged. You had Demo, Frost, Arcane, you had Augmentation, you even had Beast Mastery, possibly even Devastation or Shadow Priest. If we had to mention one of the melees right now being up there, then it would be Outlaw Rogue. Now, Outlaw has recently been the beneficiary of both bug fixes to fix the spec. The 3 biggest bugs the spec had are now gone, and 2 buffs. Blizzard redistributed them to have way more single target, for their AoE to not even lose that much, even though Fate Intertwined and Blade Flurry, their splash damage talents, were both nerfed. The old damage increase kind of made up for that. So Outlaw playing Fatebound in the beta only. I think in live you still play with Trickster, but you will move over to Fatebound in the beta, and with that Outlaw is doing quite well in Mythic Plus. Their overall damage is very good, but also their single target damage is still fine. Obviously, Outlaw has the benefit of being a spec that has Blade Flurry, so you do your consistent single target damage and then splash AoE damage around, which means your extra damage on your primary target will always be higher than the damage you do on the other targets. Now, the actual AoE damage is not that great. You might be lacking a little bit more on that compared to other specs. You might get this feeling that you need to be, as we mentioned, you need to be sort of like an Arcane Mage spec to be viable in Mythic Plus. Have your niche, your specialty be the one that does the single target damage, because it feels unlikely you will be able to keep up with the higher consistent AoE damage other specs can do. But for now, still, your overall damage is pretty nice. And if you were already a fan of Outlaw Rogue, it's not that Outlaw has changed too much. Talking about pruning, talking about many complaints of other specs losing things, Outlaw didn't really lose actual buttons. In terms of what you press on a day-to-day basis, it's still there. Your very high APM playstyle is still there. Energy permitting, since you have lost out more on energy region, you might be more starved for energy, although that problem is more relevant for raids and extended boss fights rather than Mythic Plus, where you have some more room to get your Tistle Tea and your Blade Rush and your natural energy region to continue in between packs, whereas in the raid that doesn't happen nearly as often. One of perhaps your weaknesses, although if the spec is balanced to do good damage in other ways, it's still fine, but perhaps it might be a bit disappointing still is the fact that the Apex talents are terrible. We mentioned already multiple specs for having super powerful Apex talents, like we mentioned Demo, for example, Resto Druid as well, Brewmaster also. Not you, your Apex talent Gravedigger is awful. You have the extra damage from Dispatch and even the chance to reset the cooldown of Between the Eyes. When you look at these two effects, the extra damage on Dispatch and the resets, the more resets, so more casts of Between the Eyes, these will net for less than 5% damage increase, when multiple other specs are in the 15 to 20% of the damage coming from your Apex talent. So that perhaps might come off as a bit more disappointing when it comes to hoping to gain something new and flashy once you hit the new expansion and gain your Apex talents. It's not really happening for Outlaw. But I'm sure many of you, as long as the performance is good, you won't really care that much about the Apex talents being disappointing. So we had to have this mandatory melee DPS mention for the performing specs in Mythic Plus, since for now at least there is more focus, there is a better performance at the moment when it comes to the ranged specs, which we have just gone over. Now definitely, even if we haven't mentioned some of the specs, doesn't mean that they are completely unviable or not popular, but these were the ones overall being played more in the higher level keys, or in general just being more popular towards the higher end of keys in the beta for now. So we will also see and track this based on perhaps the next week-to-week balance tuning we will have from specs, with an eye on for now at the performing ones to see if they will be tuned or if other specs will be tuned to try to reach the level of these specs right now in the beta of Midnight. For today, at the beginning of this week, on this Monday, this is what we had to go for on the recap of the better performing specs in the beta. So, with this out of the way, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have to work. We have to build an entire new wardrobe from scratch, and now you actually have to fill it all up again. Nice.